It's time to gather loved ones together for all the holidays' best spread. Lynn's has great prices on all your favorite Thanksgiving items, from delicious turkey with all the fixings to mashed potatoes and yummy pies. We have everything you need to create your perfect Thanksgiving dinner. Whether it's cooking the traditional meal, completely store-bought, or a combination of both, your best holiday meal starts here. Learn more and start shopping today at lynsgrocery.com. Lynn's, where delicious begins.
Hi, this is Greg Kihlstrom. Welcome to the Agile World podcast, where we discuss customer experience, employee experience, and transformation in an agile age. The Agile World podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To read more about the topics discussed on this show, you can go to my website at theagile.world and read my latest articles or get a copy of my latest book, The Center of Experience, a blueprint for creating an experience-led organization, now available on Amazon and other retailers. My name is Greg Kihlstrom, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of CareerGig and host of the Agile World podcast. Today, we're going to talk about agility and how you deliver customer experiences. While customer experience always requires a sharp focus on listening and adapting to customer needs, most companies have had to make much larger changes recently due to COVID-19 and the different rules of operation. To talk about this in more depth, I thought we'd explore an industry that often thrives on interactions in physical spaces, museums. We're going to explore how a museum was able to adapt its methods of delivering experience in a way that not only served the temporary needs due to COVID restrictions, but also set the organization up for future success in an increasingly online world. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Craig Langlois, Chief Experience Officer of the Berkshire Museum. First, why don't you tell me a little bit about what you do at Berkshire Museum?
Hi, Greg. As always, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
And as my title suggests, it's rather unique in the museum world right now. You don't see a lot of chief experience officers, but basically we are all about sort of integrating the museum experience across multiple platforms. And that experience could be in the museum, out in the community, or now more recently in a pretty robust virtual or digital setting. Internally, there are 5 museum departments that are part of the broader experience team. Those are exhibitions, collections, education, public programming, and our aquarium, which are all sort of the forward-facing components of the museum. My role is to sort of anticipate, design for, integrate, and manage the needs of those audiences that these departments focus on. Sometimes they can be very specific in terms of like what a school group needs when they walk into the museum, and at the same time managing the needs of, say, a family that's visiting at the same time to sort of maximize their experiences in the space, and then continuing that experience when they go back to their homes or to their schools.
Right.
That's sort of the outward-facing, look at my job. Internally, from a staffing perspective, it's providing staff with resources that they need to be successful, whether that's financial or sort of capacity building support in terms of either bringing in more sort of human resources or professional development opportunities for various staff members. The uniqueness of the Berkshire Museum and sort of our org structure has allowed us to sort of flatten the organization to a certain extent, and sort of hold all of those departments of equal weight. A lot of times in museums, you see sort of the curatorial or exhibition end of the museum sort of tying up those resources. We recognize that a lot of our in-person traffic was being driven by education and programs. So we wanted to elevate those to the same level as, say, our exhibition teams or our collections teams, and apply the same resources to make sure that they could do the job as best as they possibly could.
Well, let's start out by talking about one thing that might be fairly obvious to most listeners. Museums have had to operate by new rules in the era of coronavirus. So what was your first reaction when you knew that the way that you were operating was going to have to change both quickly and pretty drastically?
As weird as it's going to sound, opportunity. It's kind of weird to think of opportunity during a very tragic global pandemic and all of the hardships that have come out of it. But within the museum setting, and like most business, if you're trying to shift business models while still operating a physical footprint, it creates a lot of confusion, to successfully market that shift in what you might call a brand or an experience, from one day closing the doors, revamping everything, and opening up the next day can create a lot of confusion. Um,
Yeah.
you know, Interestingly, like the pandemic actually kind of set the platform for us to create a new experience that was almost expected by the audience, right? Like everyone knew that museums were going to kind of have to operate in some sort of digital or virtual world to reach audiences in a new way. Um,
Yeah.
the opportunity to close the doors and do that quickly, and apply basically all the resources that we had, um, creating physical spaces within the museum to now creating virtual spaces, was an opportunity that we were excited about, that I was excited about.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, to me, this goes to, and I know we talked about this a little bit before the show, but this speaks to it's inevitable that more and more experiences are going to go online, or were already going online in the first place. So to your point about opportunity, I think that is important. I mean, I think it's incumbent on all of us to somehow make some good out of, what is otherwise a very terrible situation around the world. So I think, if we can make some kind of good out of this, by all means, let's do it. So, I mean, I think that's certainly the right approach is, how can we make the best of it? So, along those lines, how have you adapted some of the content? Like, what are some of the ways that you've done this to cater to this more remote and virtual audience?
Sure. For starters, I think we spend a little bit of time thinking about infrastructure and how we wanted to present ourselves. So we embarked on two rather ambitious projects to sort of support the programming end. First was building and launching an entire new website, which we did in relatively record time. So we designed and populated a website in under 4 weeks, with a bunch of content that we had sort of preloaded into the back of our system.
Yeah.
Um, it's we refer to it as our Explore at Home site, which allows you to sort of get a sense for all of the programming that we've been developing over the last couple of months. And then more uniquely, we built an entire to scale virtual museum that mimics the Berkshire Museum down to the molding details. And
Oh,
we did
wow.
this in 4K resolution. And we used a platform that allowed us to manipulate it during, say, webinars or talks with curators and artists. But it also allows the end user, anyone in their home, to sort of navigate the space themselves. So basically, we built a museum video game, right?
Nice, nice.
And
That's awesome.
what's fun about that is that like we can build exhibitions in this space that feel uniquely Berkshire Museum. I think one of the strong points of the museum's physical footprint is that it feels familiar. It's been there for 117 years. It's a staple in the communities that we serve. People recognize the structure, they recognize the rooms, and we have the ability to now manipulate those spaces digitally and continue to add fresh content. So we can mount entire exhibitions of museum collections. We recently mounted a show that was supposed to be in a physical space in the museum over the summer, but had to be delayed because we were forced to be closed. We mounted that in the virtual space for people to get a sense for it. And now we can start playing with how to integrate other programs into that space. Case in point, we have a relatively successful podcast series that focuses on looking at objects that aren't on display in the museum, which we started during this downtime. And we are now populating one of the museum galleries that we built with high resolution images of the objects we're talking about in the podcast, and creating ways for you to listen to the podcast while in this virtual space.
Oh, that's great. It's
So
like an audio tour, kind of, right?
yeah, it's
Virtual audio tour.
it's a virtual audio tour.
Yeah.
And then you get into this world of accessibility too, right? Like, how do we get more people to be able to experience the physical museum in ways that they couldn't before?
That's
So
great.
yeah,
Yeah, no, I love it. And again, I mean, the creativity involved in that. I mean, I'm going to definitely check out the virtual model thing after this show. 'Cause, no, yeah, it's a really interesting way to approach it and bring that aspect of the physical space. So you mentioned when we were talking previously, you mentioned some other ways that you've been able to make money, with the obvious less foot traffic and ticket sales and things like that. How have you been able to generate some revenue in potentially like unconventional methods in this time, and what have you learned from some of that?
Yeah, so I think the most successful model that we've adopted is over the summers, we usually have a really robust camp program, which is serving 200 to 300 students coming into the museum for sort of week-long experiences. This obviously wasn't going to happen this summer, so we completely flipped that model to be a hybrid of a subscription box program and virtual learning. Where we packaged up a lot of the materials that you would use in one of these camps, either as sort of a loaner. So either loaning out, say, an iPad, a tripod, and some lighting equipment to do an animation program, or a robotics kit to do a robotics program,
Nice.
or like a physical chemistry materials to do a physical science program, and selling these as the camp experience over the summer. And you could use them in two ways. Some families they were done with virtual learning. Like, they were open about it. They're like, we don't want to log on to another Zoom session. Our kids have been in Zoom sessions since March.
Yeah.
How do we give us something that we can use independently at their own pace and when they want to do it? So we designed the boxes to meet that need. And then we also created another layer where, for a couple hours a day, you could log on to Zoom and do the experiments or ask questions of our programming staff in a group setting if that's what you wanted to have. So you could interact with other kids who are also building robots. You could share ideas and programming ideas. You could make a Alka-Seltzer rocket with a group of students at the same time and have that sort of collective experience. And these have been really successful. People have really sort of enjoyed them, and I think a lot of that comes down to there are a lot of really good subscription box programs. We use a bunch for my son, but we branded them and we created the narratives and the stories that were unique to the Berkshire Museum. So we tied in our collections, we tied in programming that our audiences are familiar with into these boxes. So it made them feel like something they already knew versus something new that they had to kind of figure out. And we plan on continuing these. We can plan on using them in the future, both as sort of like when the museum's up and running and we can all kind of gather again, as something you can pick up in the gift shop. In the fall, we're looking to roll these out as sort of an after-school experience, knowing that a lot of those experiences that were happening in school can't happen in school anymore. Due to COVID restrictions. So how do we support learning in our community? How do we support families in our community and, keep a revenue coming into the museum while we're still sort of operating under limited physical access?
Yeah. And I mean, what I like about that too is, I will say everyone has obviously been trying to find their way over the last several months on how to do everything from conferences to, in your case, museum experiences. And frankly, there's been a lot of what I would term lazy approaches to, let's just slap it on Zoom and call it a day and stuff. So, what I really like about what you were saying is not only I want to try the Alka-Seltzer rocket out, but I want to. I think it's interesting. You got real feedback, and you got feedback from parents that said, "Listen, don't give me another Zoom meeting," and stuff like that. How was that? How did you get that feedback? Was it was it a methodical approach, or how did you kind of determine what was going to be the best fit to get that feedback from your customers?
So we did some audience surveys. We reached out to audiences that we serve on a regular basis. And then a lot of it is just sort of knowing your audience and having open conversations and dialogues with them. Where we're located in Berkshire County, it's a relatively small community. The footprint that we serve is roughly 4 states all kind of congregating around this corner in Western Massachusetts. But there are, community interactions. Our staff are out in the community, shopping and attending other events. They have their own individual networks. One of the things we strive for is those sort of opportunities to have conversations outside the museum walls where we can gather that information in safe ways. And kind of taking the temperature of our audience. I mean, it's it's having trust, right? It's the audience trusting you, and them knowing that what you're going to put forward is in the best interest of both them and the organization.
That's great, and I mean, to me, that's the true spirit of customer experience, and so no, I think that's great. Well, let's talk now a little bit about things moving forward. I mean, eventually, at some point, hopefully sooner than later, but at some point, things will resume to at least, let's call it some semblance of normalcy, and you alluded to that as well. Of some of these things can be used in the long term, but what other lessons have you learned that will help the museum be more adaptive in the future?
Cross train your staff. Right.
Yeah.
And I think the bigger one is find those hidden talents. One of the interesting things about the Berkshire Museum is that a lot of our sort of academic or formal trainings are not in sort of museum studies. We all either have that experience either through work experience or a few of us do have it from a sort of academic background, but the majority of our staff come with this variety of backgrounds, whether it's AV training or theatric training, and how do you utilize those skills to create really unique and robust experiences? And that's what we relied upon during this time of sort of the quick flip from physical interactions to virtual interactions. Like, how do we take someone who has a theater background and apply their knowledge and sort of lighting design to creating a virtual museum layout? How do we use that skill? How do we take someone who has dabbled in audio video work, as their own sort of like personal projects and elevate them within the organization to support our audio and visual needs during this time, and sort of really looking for those hidden talents. And I think going forward, as we get back to some sort of normalcy or whatever our new normal kind of looks like, and thinking about bringing new staff on, is making sure that we're paying close attention to those skills, and asking the right questions during our interview process to sort of make sure that we can find people who have those sort of hidden talents that they want to advance, and find to help them advance.
Well, I love the idea of the hidden talents, and it, in a sense, it's creativity in the broadest sense of the term. So not it's finding that creativity. It's being creative about whether it's creating experiences or even business models. Because I mean, you've uncovered a few things that it doesn't sound like were even on your radar. The subscription boxes and all those kinds of things. There's a lot of things that were born out of just necessity and a need to do that. I mean, how do you see this? I know you're part of a team, but how do you see your part, or even the organization's part, in fostering that? I mean, you spoke to the need for it, but how would you encourage that in the long term? How do you look for it? How do you just encourage that as part of a culture?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's like open and honest communication, right? It's thinking of how all the individual team members fit together, and making sure that they all feel valued, and that the skills that they bring to the table, regardless of what position you hold within the organization, are there, and having that conversation with all staff. I think one of the things that small museums struggle with is the ability to elevate within the organizations, because the staff tends to be small. We're a staff of 30, versus, say, an organization that has 300 people, and you can create movement vertically a little easier there. So I think here the goal is sort of recognizing those skills, helping managers identify them when they're hiring staff. And then I think having sort of, COVID switching aside is really sort of setting a direction for the organization where um, we have the flexibility to do flips like this, but I don't think like we want to run an organization that's flipping constantly, right? So setting a direction for 3 years, right? Like setting a direction for 5 years and be like, all right, these are our institutional goals. This is where we want to see growth. This is where we want to keep things sort of where they are. This is what our vision for the future is, whether that's, architectural improvements and how that fits into programming, or whether that's, programming improvements and how we want to grow audiences, or if we're maxing out an audience, like how do we shift resources around? And just giving that clear communication and clear direction once we can kind of reopen the museum, so that we can get everyone kind of on the same page and everyone kind of going for that goal. And then using staff time to sort of evaluate those goals, and are we hitting them? Are we hitting those metrics? Are we creating the experiences that we want to create? What's missing there? Is it a financial resource that we need to identify? Is it a human resource that we need to identify? And helping to bring those things forward and bring everyone along.
Yeah. Well, and I think this somewhat segues to the last thing I wanted to talk about with you, and is your professional background and how you kind of came into the role of CXO. And it wasn't necessarily your initial trajectory in your professional career, but talk a little bit about how you got into your current position and what kind of brought you there.
Sure. I mean, my origin story is long and complicated. I will give the abbreviated version, but
Sure.
I didn't start in museum studies. I didn't start in what many would consider a creative field. I actually started in medicine, and just found myself wanting to push the boundaries in that system in a way that I wasn't allowed to, asking questions that were not the right questions to be asking in that environment. So I actually did sort of a 180 in my early college years of moving into fine art training and exploring fine art as a background. I ended up with a degree in art education and then eventually an MFA in ceramics, and was working as a college professor for a while, and kind of stumbled upon museum work, and from a programming standpoint, creating programs for public audiences, which I really enjoyed. Right, I enjoyed the challenge of how to relate objects in a space or paintings on a wall to a variety of audiences, and find that sort of spark. Right, I think one of the things that museums do really well is sort of shortening the learning curve. Like if you're trying to wrap your head around a very complex social issue or a scientific issue, or just baseline knowledge, right? Like you can do a lot of research yourself, and try to pull all these different pieces together, and you'll eventually make the connection. But a lot of times you can head to a local museum, and a lot of that work is encompassed in the artifacts and interpretation that are on display, and help you make that sort of cognitive leap quicker. I really enjoyed that sort of leap moment where I could see audiences, or I could see groups of students kind of getting really complex issues quickly, because they're looking at objects, they're interacting with things, they're having a dialogue with me. And that kind of really sort of put me on the trajectory for museum work and my career, where from public programming to designing education programming, both in Berkshire County and on sort of larger state models, and given the opportunity to really sort of grow and uh, create new opportunities and new audiences within the Berkshire Museum, kind of help set the organization model to think about creating sort of an experience head. Like I mentioned earlier, lots of museums sort of silo those organizations, but I kind of made the pitch that we need to de-silo those individual departments and bring them together, because the programming end is just as important as the exhibition end, and how do we get those to kind of work in tandem? And it was a kind of a holistic approach, right? It was as an org, kind of sat down and thought about what we wanted to be and where we wanted to go, and sort of redesigned the organization to meet those needs, with me adopting the chief experience role.
Well, one last thing to kind of wrap up. For similar organizations, maybe not even specifically museums, but similar organizations that might be struggling with how to make these great experiences, what advice would you give, even as some restrictions might get lifted or things like that?
Good question. I think it's twofold, right? I think the first is like knowing your audience. If you are a museum that focuses on X, Y, and Z, whatever you're creating virtually, like focus on X, Y, and Z. Make those things as strong as they possibly can be, just in that new environment. We were fortunate enough to really go really high tech with it, but I don't think that's super necessary a lot of times to speak to your audiences, as long as you're talking in your authentic voice. And then I think second is build off the trust that you have. It kind of comes back to the first point, right? It's like be the organization that you set out to be. Don't be something different, and then think about the long game, right? From an experience standpoint, we at the museum didn't create anything that we didn't think we're going to use in the future. We didn't just create like COVID programming and then that programming is going to go away. Spend some time thinking about how those two things are going to integrate when you have to reopen or you choose to reopen, and how they can support those endeavors to reach a broader audience versus just kind of shutting it down. Because I think will do more damage than good.
Well, Craig, thanks so much for joining the show. For those listening, what's the best way for them to learn more about what you're doing and keep up with things?
Sure. The easiest way is to go to explore.berkshiremuseum.org, and you can find all of our virtual programming as well as information on new physical experiences within the museum.
Great. Well, again, I'd like to thank Craig Langlois, Chief Experience Officer at the Berkshire Museum, for joining the show. To learn more about customer and employee experience, I recommend you go to my website at gregkillstrom.com and make sure to check out my latest book, The Center of Experience. More information is available on my website or wherever the book is available, like Amazon. Thanks again for listening to The Agile World with Greg Killstrom. See you next week. Thanks again for listening to the Agile World podcast, brought to you by Tech Systems. I'm your host, Greg Killstrom. You can learn more and get a copy of my latest book, The Center of Experience, from my website at theagile.world or on Amazon or other retailers. Until next week, stay agile.